My name is Tom Draths, from the class of 2003, and I'm fortunate enough to have the title of acting president of the Notre Dame College Prep Alumni Association. That's a title that I have out of respect for the guy I get to induct tonight, Brian Murray. The title acting president is one that I chose instead of interim president because it reminds me that I'm acting for Brian Murray, and that is I've done for the last 19 years and will continue to do for the rest of my life. I'll try to act like Brian Murray. It's with the greatest honor that I'm here tonight to speak on his behalf. Hopefully I can do some justice to describe how worthy Brian was of this award. And as Dick said, I know it's one that he was thrilled to receive. When I started preparing this speech, my idea was to do a lighthearted roast of Brian and some of his more peculiar habits. The way he liked a good back shave on a hot summer day. His unusual affinity for dill-flavored snacks like popcorn and chips. The way he loved cold beer so much that he would put 2 or 3 in your freezer, inevitably forget that he did that, and leave you 2 or 3 frozen beers exploded in your freezer the next day. Or how the greatest compliment you could ever get from Brian was a simple lean in out of the side of his mouth. Big fan. But as I started to put my ideas on paper, I realized that Brian and I had too much in common to really do a good roast, because if I was making fun of Brian for his background, his beliefs, his fandom, I would really be making fun of myself. And while Brian had very thick skin, I certainly do not. So here are the things that Brian and I had in common. We're both the second sons of fathers who graduated from St. Pat's in the class of 1970. In the next 25 years, our fathers became very smart. They didn't send us to St. Pat's. They sent us to Notre Dame. Brian and I both have older brothers named John, who ironically went by their initials, J.P. Murray, J.W. Draths. They're both left-handed, and they use their left hands to beat some sense into us and try to mold us into productive members of society. In J.P.'s case, it worked, and in my brother's, I'm not so sure. Brian and I were both Northside White Sox fans, something that we took a lot of pride in. We both loved Mark Burley, Ozzie Guillen, Hawk Harrelson. In fact, in 2005, I don't know if you guys remember 2005, the White Sox won the World Series that year. We were sophomores in college, and Brian was studying abroad in Limerick, Ireland. And one afternoon, I'll never forget, it was a Thursday day game. And he was messaging us online saying, you got to watch the game today. And sure enough, in the 4th or the 5th inning, Hawk Harrelson came on and said, we got an email in from Limerick, Ireland. Brian Murray wants to say hello to his friends, Tom Draths and Eric Sander. And can you give a Limerick, Ireland? Yes. And Hawk enthusiastically did so. It's a clip that I still have on my phone and I listen to frequently. Brian and I both shared the same political beliefs. Without the risk of polarizing half the room, I won't tell you what those beliefs were. But let's just say we were right, and if you disagreed with us, you were wrong. When we grew up, or when we were still growing up, Brian and I decided to be lawyers. Brian represented people who got hurt, and I represented the people who hurt them. And when people ask what we did for a living and what kind of lawyers we would do, or we were, I would always say we do the opposite of one another. And that would leave an opportunity for Brian to chime in. Yeah, I win cases. Draths loses them. It's a pretty good line. Brian and I both went to Catholic grammar schools and state colleges. Of course, he went to far inferior ones. We went to IC in Illinois State, and I went to University of Illinois in St. Juliana. But in between, we had this school and this community, both of which we hold dearly in our hearts. With all that in common, Brian and I had one huge difference. People liked Brian. They liked him immediately, and they liked him genuinely. With me, on the other hand, it took some warming up to get to that point. But people loved Brian because he was approachable, because he was a good listener, because he was a great audience, regardless of whether you wanted a laugh or advice, because he was funny, smart, sincere, and kind. Brian was raised very well. He was the greatest guy, the greatest friend, and the greatest Don. There's no one more deserving of this award than Brian Murray. For those of us who knew Brian very well, and I'd like to consider myself to be one of those people, he was the kind of guy who would talk to anybody. He was always shaking hands and BSing with people, making friends with strangers. If you didn't know him better, you would think he was campaigning for office. In fact, he developed the nickname the Alderman among many people in our neighborhood. But Brian was no BSer. He was a straight-up guy who just liked to talk, and more importantly, he liked to listen. And although he wasn't running for office or trying to win awards, as Joe pointed out, he was always campaigning. He campaigned to make others feel good because it made him feel good to do so. And he did that better than anyone I've ever met. His campaign represented everything that he learned from this community and from this school. And his campaign earned him a spot in this Hall of Honor. But Brian's campaign was one of friendship. If this were Cooperstown and he had his plaque, his stats alone would have made him one of the greatest of all time. 4 times he was the best man at people's weddings. Over 10 times he was a groomsman at somebody's wedding. And he's a godfather to multiple children. The best way I can describe the way that we looked at Brian as a friend is we would take a retreat up to our friends' cottages every winter. We called it our male sensitivity weekend. And the conversation turned one of those years to who we would like or who we would allow to date our sisters in our group. A lot of us have younger sisters. And I don't know if it was a unanimous blind vote or if we just all came to the same conclusion that Brian was the only one that we would allow to date our sisters. But Brian remembered that and may have taken it a little too literally with some of our sisters. But with a few slaps on the wrist, he relented. Brian's campaign was one of loyalty and one of commitment. When he said he was going to be somewhere, he was there. He may have been 20 minutes late, 30 minutes late, an hour late, but he got there. He was one of the most loyal people I've ever met. When we were in our second year of law school, my girlfriend and I at the time broke up, and we didn't break up on my terms. And I told Brian about it, and I don't know if it was a Friday night or a Saturday night. The first thing he did was go on Facebook and immediately defriend my girlfriend. Was it spiteful? Yes. I never forgot it. Oh, and by the way, my girlfriend and I got back together within that week. Got engaged a few years later and just recently celebrated our 4-year wedding anniversary. She didn't forget it either. Brian's campaign was also one of family. It was important to Brian that his friends were friends with his family. We knew all about the Murrays, the Milners, the Murtaughs, the Kulas, even the Mocklers. We also knew about the legendary family friends like Case, Duff, Uncle Randy, who wasn't really an uncle, Cousin Ron, who wasn't really a cousin. Brian was also very proud of his heritage, and we would tease him because, I don't know if anyone here knows this, he was 75% Irish and 25% British. And we would tell him that he was internally at conflict with himself. And later in his life, he learned to reconcile that by being Irish 5 days a week, and on Saturdays and Sundays, spending his time watching soccer, drinking tea, eating full English breakfast, and referring to the United States as the colonies, probably. Brian's campaign was one of faith, scholarship, and service. Brian had faith in himself. He had faith in his God. He had faith in the people who took care of him. He had faith that his family and his friends would be okay, even if he wasn't. Brian was also a student. a student of the law, in my opinion, the most noble pursuit. But he also studied history and politics. He loved Irish history, British history, American history. He read more than anyone else I ever knew. He read books that had words in them, not just pictures. Brian's campaign was one of service. He was a leader in this community. In his year as president of the Alumni Association, we raised more money than we ever have in the past. And this coming March, when we give out scholarships, we're anticipating that we'll give out over $100,000 in scholarships. Now, of course, not all of that was Brian's doing, but there's nothing more presidential than taking credit for something else you didn't do. Brian's campaign was one of honesty. It's a well-known fact that Brian never lied. And that's because he lived according to a motto, it's not a lie if you believe it. For those of you who don't know, that's from the great 20th century scholar and philosopher George Louis Costanza. Brian believed everything he ever said, so he never lied. Although, looking back, we have our doubts as to whether he actually swam across the English Channel and whether Mrs. Murray actually dated Paul McCartney in high school. Brian lived a good life. He was kind to others. He never walked alone. So, Murr, I know you're doing your best right now to get wins for the Dons and the Irish. I just want to lean in and say, big fan. So if everyone can raise their glasses. To our friend, to our brother, to our alderman, Brian Murray. Your life was one hell of a campaign. And the ballots have been cast and the votes have all been counted. And to the surprise of absolutely nobody, you won. Go Dons.